I'm going to spend a minute talking about acids and bases in the kitchen. So when we think about baking soda is an example of a base. And so if we consider a scale of acids, which react with bases, baking soda is on the side with the base, and then at neutral, we would have water. So water is not going to react on either side. And just to give a framework, we don't incorporate a lot of things in the kitchen that would be considered bases, but you do encounter them a lot when you're cleaning. Things like drain cleaner and lye are very strong base. So obviously we're not using that when we're baking in the kitchen unless you're trying to make very authentic pretzels. But baking soda is a milder base than drain cleaner. And so it will react with acids, and there's lots of different acids in the kitchen, varying from citrus fruits like lemons, vinegar, honey, buttermilk, coffee are all acidic foods. And so these will react with something like baking soda because acids and bases react with each other. So to consider how this would work in a kitchen and how we can use this to incorporate more air into our bakes, think back to maybe a middle school science fair and the quintessential baking soda and vinegar volcano. So when we're baking, we want to choose acid and base combinations like this that when they react will produce carbon dioxide, some kind of gas that will make these bubbles when we bake. And so when you mix vinegar and baking soda, you get all of these bubbles, these carbon dioxide bubbles forming, and that's what makes these really fun science fair volcanoes. So this then translates to other acid and base mixtures that we might use in the kitchen, say making buttermilk pancakes, where you have buttermilk, which is an acid, and baking soda, which is a base. And these create some air to make your pancakes nice and light and fluffy. So when we talk about baking soda, I think a lot of people also think, well, what about baking powder? How are these things different, and can you use them interchangeably? So as we just mentioned, baking soda, baking soda is a single chemical. It's called sodium bicarbonate, and it needs to react with an acid. So it's a base, so we need to add an acid to it. So, baking powder, on the other hand, is baking soda, so sodium bicarbonate, but also has an acid component in it. So this is why you might be able to make cookies that only have baking soda in it, even if you're not adding in something acidic, because it already contains the acid that's needed for the reaction. So baking powder was invented in the 1840s by a man named Alfred Bird, and he worked on formulating this because his wife was allergic to eggs and yeast, which are other common ways for making things rise, and he wanted to find something that he could use in the kitchen with her that she could eat, but that would still be able to introduce this air into the bake. So he needed something that would put air into the food that they were making to make nice, light, fluffy bakes without using yeast or eggs. And so he formulated this mixture of a base and acids that you could put in a jar on your shelf, and that's basically ready to use air, so that when you add water to it, they're going to react, the acid and the base, and then you'll get air bubbles in whatever batters you're creating. So the baking powder that we use in our kitchens is called double acting. And what this means is that there's actually two different acids that react with the baking soda in the powder. So the first reaction occurs when the powder gets wet. So when you add it into your mixture, you're adding liquids, you start to see bubbles form. You'll often see this if you're making like a very wet dough, and you start to see lots of bubbles form even if you just let it sit there and you're not mixing it. That's because the baking powder has already been activated. And then there's a second acid reaction that occurs when it's heated. And so when you put the cake into the oven or whatever you're baking, then this creates even more air. And so you're not just left with the air that you put into your mixture when it goes into the oven. There's even more being produced by this reaction as it bakes in the heat. So thus far, we've talked about how eggs can give structure to our bakes and how they can hold air in, as well as how we can introduce even more air with baking soda and baking powder, and how we can use these chemical reactions to benefit our baking in the kitchen. So at this point, I'm going to take a brief break and take any questions that people have about using eggs in bakes, getting things to be nice and light and fluffy using baking soda and powder. Yes, in the blue.
Well, whenever people talk about the whisking, making the egg proteins do their thing, I'm always curious, why is it that something so macroscopic as, you know, I mean, on the scale of that little egg protein, the whisk is an enormous, giant lumbering stick of plastic plowing through. How is that causing this tiny little protein to unfold? Is it really from the mechanical action, or is there some other chemical change taking place?
Right.
Denatures the protein.
So the question is that if you're whisking up egg whites with a whisk, the whisk is very, very big in comparison to the very, very small proteins that are unfolding. And so how are these things able to interact? To be honest, I'm not entirely sure. I think some of it has to do with the air that's being introduced by the whisking, as well as the fact that it is creating some heat and disrupting the protein structures. And even if the whisk itself is very large, it's causing the proteins to move against each other, to move against the water and the air molecules. So there's lots of things that are getting mixed up. And so the molecules aren't just interacting with the whisk itself, they're also interacting with each other. And so these, all of these different interactions can cause the proteins to unfold and then aggregate together. Yes, in the vest.
A couple of related questions. One is whisking eggs better than baking soda and baking powder? And two, it seems like there's an ideal amount of agitation that you would want. It seems that you could underdo it and you could overdo it. Can you elaborate?
Yes, so the first question being, is there an ideal one between when would you use whipped eggs versus when you would use baking soda or baking powder? And it depends on the recipe. So recipes are often very specific in what they call for, because when you're adding whisked eggs, you're also going to be introducing some liquid. And so that's usually some of the liquid of the recipe comes from that. Whereas with baking soda or baking powder, you're adding in other liquids. And so you can't usually just substitute one across for the other. Although that's definitely something that people go into when they're looking at modifying recipes and how can you change those things. You do have to be careful with baking soda, especially because if you don't get the right ratio of acid to baking soda, some of the baking soda can be left unreacted and it has a kind of metallic taste. And so if you've ever made something with baking soda and you bite into it and you're like, this tastes weird, it probably means that it didn't all react. And so there's some soda left unreacted. And then the second half of your question was?
It seems like there's an ideal amount of agitation.
Right, right.
You can overdo it, you can underdo it.
Right, and again, so what's the ideal amount of agitation for whipping eggs? And again, that's something that recipes instruct on. They usually say we want it at a soft peak phase or at a hard peak phase, and it has to do with when you pull up the whisk, how much does the egg fall back down? Or if you move the whisk over it, does it leave a trail? And recipes are usually pretty descriptive in this, and it's kind of interesting. You can watch videos of what they all look like, but again, it affects how stiff and how much rise you'll get in your bakes. And so when you read recipes, if they say they want it at a certain phase, there's usually a reason for it. All right, and one last one in the green.
Thank you for taking my question. I have two questions. The first one is, you said that why the egg white is what caused the air. So, but my question is, if you also include the yolk, that can keep the air, can even so the egg white still develop the air bubbles?
All right, so the question is, if you don't separate the egg whites from the egg yolks and you whip them together, can you still incorporate air? You can. You won't incorporate as much air, and you have to whisk for a lot longer because the fats that are in the egg yolk also interact with the proteins, and so they don't all aggregate in the same way and form as stiff of a structure. But you can do it, and some recipes have you do that because of the extra flavor from the egg yolks.
Okay. So the second question is, where's where baking soda comes from. Is that man-made or is from nature?
So the question is, where does baking soda come from? That's a good question. I mean, it's commercially manufactured now, but where it originally comes from, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to continue on to the next section of the talk, but we'll have more time for questions at the end of this section as well. So now that we've created all of these pieces of our hypothetical cake, we have to bake it. And so what's going to happen to a cake when we bake it in a conventional oven? And so there's really three phases to what happens to a cake when it's baked. So first, as it starts to heat up, the air expands. And so this is what we talked about, is the air that's trapped inside of the cake batter heats up, it expands, and this is what forms these bubbles in your cake. And while this is happening, other components in your cake mixture, so the proteins in the egg whites, the protein in the flour, which is what we call gluten, as well as starches that are present in the flour, stretch around these air bubbles. And so this is called expansion. And then as the temperature continues to rise, there's a phase called setting. And this is when the proteins in the eggs and in the gluten start to come together and coagulate. And the starches from the flour have absorbed water and they start to form this sort of gel. And so this is when, if you went into the oven and you wiggled your cake, it wouldn't just slosh around like batter. It's starting to take some form and become more of a set cake. And then finally, at high temperatures, you have browning. And so this is when you start to see a crust form on the top of your cake, or you get a crust on your bread. And this only occurs at very high temperatures due to specific reactions called, and just here as an example, you can see you get air introduced and you get this nice browning on the top. And so this browning is formed from a reaction called the Mired reaction. And so this is a specific chemical reaction that occurs only at high temperatures, so at least 300 degrees Fahrenheit. So like in a baking oven, you're usually baking around 350 to 400 degrees. And so there's sugars in the proteins, so sugars that you've added or that are present in your bake, and then proteins such as from the egg or from the gluten and flour interact with each other and undergo chemical reactions that lead to the formation of new molecules that introduce new flavors. And so these molecules aren't particularly well characterized. There's lots and lots of different forms of, they call them Mired products. And some have been studied, but a lot of them aren't very well known, other than there's lots of different ones that form from these reactions. And they contribute to a lot of foods that we like that have this nice flavor that you really only get when you have these Mired reaction and this nice brown bake. So on breads, especially on pretzels, that nice deep dark brown color is from Mired products, as well as like the browning on pastries. This isn't exclusive to baking. You can get it anytime you have proteins and sugars, just like in meats, when you're grilling a steak or when you're baking a chicken. And you could compare this to, say, if you're poaching a chicken, so it's really enveloped in water the whole time, and boiling water only reaches just over 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and so this isn't hot enough for Mired reactions to occur. So that's why when you poach a chicken, it's very soft, but it remains white on the outside. You don't get these brownings. That only occurs once all of the water is gone and you can heat it up to a high enough temperature for Mired products to form. So we love all of these different baked goods, but sometimes it takes a while to bake a cake. You know, it's going to take an hour in the oven, and sometimes that's just too long. So what if we wanted to bake something in a microwave? Can you do it? And how do we have to modify recipes to make that work? So it can be done. This is your quintessential mug cake, which I ate many of in my college dorm room and sometimes still do when I don't have time to bake a proper cake. So these can be really great, but sometimes they don't always work out because you want the inside to be nice and gooey, but sometimes it's just sticky. Or you want it to be fluffy, but it ends up kind of rubbery. Or maybe the outside looks like it's not set, and then by the time it finally does, it's burnt. And so why are these things happening in a microwave so quickly when it takes so much longer for these to happen in an oven, and how do we prevent these? So to understand that, we need to talk about how are microwaves different from conventional ovens. So conventional ovens are heating everything fairly equally. You're heating up the air in the oven, you're putting your cake into this nice warm environment. But when you're in a microwave, microwaves are specifically heating molecules like water. And so they make the water molecules move very, very, very quickly. And this is generating heat that's then passed to the rest of the batter around the water. And so this is when it starts to cook, is from the heat from the water molecules as they're getting excited. But then some of the water molecules are also leaving the cake as steam. So by the time when you take it out, a lot of the water has left, but you finally had the heat transfer all the way from the outside to the inside of the cake to bake it. Because again, the microwaves aren't going to penetrate all the way through to the center of your batter. They're going to heat water molecules on the outside, and then that heat will transfer into the center. And so this is why when you're baking a mug cake like this, you often want to eat it very quickly after it's done, because your only liquid in here is your water, and you've lost a lot of that as you've been cooking it. Additionally, because you're cooking this at a lower temperature, so it's only just over 200, because all of your heat's coming from the water. And so as we mentioned with the example of the chicken, you're not going to get any Maillard reactions here. So that's why you don't get a nice brown crust on these cakes, because they're not heated up high enough. Additionally, this water, since it's so hot, it's leaving the cake, it's not binding to the starch molecules, so you don't get this as nice of a structure from your starch molecules in your water. And so that's why often, as soon as all of the water is gone, like if you let it sit for too long after you take it out of the microwave, you sort of end up with a rock, because you really need the water that's left in this mug cake to be there to add some moisture to it while it's around. So mug cakes are fun, they're easy, they're quick. There's tons of recipes for them on the internet, but just make sure that you're always watching it, that you put in enough water, and that you eat it right away, and just enjoy the fact that it should have a nice gooey center. So in this half of the talk, we've talked about, again at the beginning, how eggs and now how flour and starch can give structure to our bakes, as well as the differences between using beaten eggs and baking soda and powder, and also then what happens to these cakes when they're baked in the oven, how Maillard reactions lead to nice browning of these cakes, as well as why that doesn't happen in a microwave, but we can still use microwaves to bake cakes like mug cakes. And so this is the end of this first half of the talk about the chemistry of baking. And so once again, I'll pause and take any questions before we go on to the break. Yes?
So let's take my question.
Yeah.
And I noticed you were talking about bases and acids, and it reminded me of the idea of base metals in alchemy and the history of chemistry and such. Do you have any idea why the acid kind of base and the metal kind of base are related, and what the history behind that is?
So the question is there any relation between the bases here that react with acids and base metals? So I'm not 100% sure, but I think base metals is a completely different category. I think it's a reference to one of the columns in the periodic table. I'm not sure, but bases in the acid and base term are also referred to as alkalines. And so there are some elements that are alkali earth metals, and some of those are components of bases, but they're not particularly related in any way. But there are metals elements that are components of baking soda and things like that. But there's lots of different types of bases, just like there's lots of different types of acids. Yes, in the blue.
I often buy the egg beaters, and sometimes there's just egg whites, and sometimes there's a mixture. I guess I'm wondering about the maybe the composition of that mixture that I'm buying. Like,
Yeah.
Is it made with this in mind, maybe for baking, or is it just like scrambling?
Yeah, so the question is, what's the composition of like egg beaters, egg substitutes, and can you use those for baking? So you can whip up anything that's really rich in protein. So some like vegan egg substitutes would use flaxseed. It's very rich in protein. You can grind it up and you can actually whip it up like you would egg whites. And so probably depending on the egg beaters, like you said, there's different types of substitutes. And so I'd imagine that there's some that are probably labeled for baking. The same goes for like margarines and butter substitutes. Some of them are specifically made to be better for baking than others, which are better just for eating. But so long as it has a high enough protein content, those proteins will unfold and then come back together and form these structures. For the same reasons as you can whip up whipped cream. It's very high in proteins, and so those proteins again are going to be forming structures around the air that you've introduced into the cream. Yes, in the red.
I think that there are 3 types of transmit heat to a specific thing, and one is radiation, and the other 2 I don't remember. But I'm pretty sure the microwave is by radiation,
yes.
right?
Yes.
So with your talk about something heats exciting the water molecules, but that is radiation. So I'm wondering, I don't know how to try to do this. Maybe boil an egg when you put the egg in water, which the microwave is going to transmit the heat to the water, but the water is going to heat and then it's going to touch directly the egg, and theoretically it should be making a boiled egg.
Yes. So the question is, can you use microwaves to like cook things in water? Like if you wanted to make a boiled egg, could you do it in the microwave?
Because the water gets excited.
Yes, because the water would get hot and boil. Exactly, so you could definitely do that. So because the whole point of boiling an egg is you just need to get the water to a boiling point and keep it at that time for a specific number of minutes, depending on how hard or soft you want the egg. And you can definitely do that in a microwave. You could put the egg in a container of water and just watch the water to see until it boils, and then keep it boiling for a specific amount of time. That would definitely work in a microwave because, as you said, the water is going to be transferring that heat to the egg just like it would on the stovetop in that case. Yes?
Can you talk about the difference between caramelizing and the Mired reactions? It seems like they're 2 different versions of similar things.
Yes, so the question is, what's the difference between caramelizing and Mired reactions? So I don't know all of the specifics, but Mired reactions are a reaction between proteins and sugars, and so that's why you're getting them forming on meats and things like this, whereas caramelizing is just sugar. So you can caramelize, you can just put sugar in a pan and heat it up and it will caramelize. And so it's a different form of reaction, but we often associate a lot of the same flavors, and sometimes you get both going on. You might have sugars in, like there's that picture of that steak that was nicely browned on the outside. Some of those are probably Mired products, and some of it's probably caramelization, especially if you have it in there with a sauce with a lot of sugar. So both of them happen at high temperatures. They have slightly different temperature ranges, but you can definitely get both occurring, or you can only get one sometimes. Yes?
Thank you again for taking my question. Is better the order in which you put ingredients, or it doesn't matter as long as you have them in the right amount?
So the question is, does it matter what order you put in ingredients, or do only the amounts matter? It depends on the recipe. So sometimes certain ingredients need to be incorporated together. So say a recipe says for like making scones or biscuit, and it says we want you to like cut the flour into cut the butter into the flour with your fingers, because you need to make sure all this butter is nicely incorporated before you add in, say, the milk. Whereas if you added the milk to the flour and then tried to mix in the butter, it would just be a mess. And so oftentimes the order in which they tell you to put in ingredients is for reasons like that, and it often has to do with, they say, mix your dry things and then start adding your liquid things so that all of your dry ingredients get mixed together evenly, because it's easier to have even incorporation of ingredients that way. So in general, follow what the recipe says, and if you don't, it might end up not working out so well, but it may also be that you can take a shortcut. So if you want to experiment, go for it. It's fun. So,
Thanks.
yes. Any more questions? Yes, in the back. About the microwave?
I don't usually use microwaves in my house because I don't have one. But one time I went to my friend's house and we had to clean the microwave because something exploded.
Yeah.
Why did it explode?
So the question is, why do things explode sometimes in the microwave? So often this happens because microwaves heat things very quickly, and they're heating water, and sometimes you might have more pockets of water in food than in others. This especially happens when you're heating frozen things, or if you're, say, melting butter or something that doesn't have a lot of liquid water in it. And so one area will get very hot and it will boil and sort of pop everything else out around it. And that often happens in a microwave, just again because you're heating things very quickly and they're not really getting mixed around. So that's why microwaves often have that spinning turntable in the middle, so you don't get these like hot spots in your food. And if you don't have a turntable, or even if you do, you should always stir things to help distribute the heat evenly in whatever it is that you're cooking. Yes, one last question.
When you whip the egg whites, then some of the recipes will add sugar, and that seems to have some kind of reaction with the egg whites. Can you explain what's going on there?
Yeah, so the question is, why do some recipes have you add sugar in with the egg whites? So the sugar is just helping add more structure there, so you can have more the proteins can also interact with the sugar molecules, and so you can get sort of a little bit better structure, and sometimes it whips up faster. You just have more molecules that can interact with each other. And often, also times recipes have that because then you're going to be eating the egg whites and you want to have a little bit of flavor in them. Or if you're going to like make a tart and you're going to torch the top, you need to have both the proteins and the sugars there to make that nice brown color. Yes?
Why can't you put aluminum foil in a microwave?
So the question is, why can't you put foil in a microwave? So microwaves excite molecules that have slight charges on them. So water has a very slight charge, and so it behaves very nicely in a microwave. It just sort of moves around. It's very small, so it's easy for it to move around, and that's why microwaves are so good at heating water. If you put something in the microwave that actually has a charge to it, like a lot of metals do, the microwaves cause it to spark, and so that's why you can't put metals in the microwave, because any charged molecules like that react with the microwaves. The microwaves excite them in different ways that we don't want to excite things. So when I say that microwaves only heat water, it is a simplification, but in the purposes of what you're cooking in foods, it's the water that's doing the grunt work in the microwave. Yes, one last question, and then we'll take a break.
Are there things other than food that can't be put into a microwave other than I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to say this, but no, I mean other than metals and stuff that have a slight charge, is there anything that can't be put into the microwave other than plastic? So
the question is, are there other things that we shouldn't put into the microwave other than just metals? Yes, there definitely are. So oftentimes you look at dishes and it says this is microwave safe or this isn't microwave safe, and that has to do with what it's made of. And so there's things like a Pyrex glass or some plastics that say microwave safe. It's because they're designed by people who understand what types of molecules the microwaves will interact with, and they make sure that those aren't in those structures. So sometimes you might have like a nice a pottery bowl, and when you make pottery, it has water in it and it's still wet, and so if you put it in the microwave it might get really hot because there's probably some residual water in it. But then there's other types of pottery, other types of glass that have been heated for long enough to get rid of any water, and so then those are microwave safe. And so when you're looking at things that say the mug you want to make your mug cookie in, make sure that the mug says it's microwave safe so that it doesn't get too hot. It will still get hot because the cake that you're making in the mug will transfer some heat to the mug, but there will still, the cup itself won't be getting hot.
Like
All right.
the sponge, very dirty. You can put water in 1 minute, and it's supposed to sterilize a little bit.
Yes, it's because it's like putting it in boiling water. Heating a sponge in the microwave is like heating up a sponge in boiling water to sterilize it, so that works as well. All right, so we're going to take a short break now so that Kiara still has time to give her section, because she's going to come back and talk about yeast and other friendly microbes that we encounter in the kitchen. So if you're interested in going on a tour of a yeast lab, you can come down and sign up here at the front. We have 12 spots for that, and then Kiara will come back.
Also,
Or sorry,
I'll be serving up some small mixing cups of Kombucha, which will be a topic in the next part of the talk, if you want to.
So if you want to try some microbe fermented kombucha,
you'll get to see how it's made.
All right, so as Renee introduced me earlier, I am Kiara. I'm also a graduate student here at Harvard. And so up until now, you've been introduced to baking and introducing air into your bakes and how there are various chemical ways you can do this. But chemistry is not the only tool that we utilize in order to get our food to be the way we want it to be. Another way is biology, which is what I'm going to be covering next. And so you think of microbes in your kitchen, that sounds like the bacteria in the sponge that you put in the microwave to disinfect, or just generally things you really wouldn't want in your food. But actually they're a very core part of how we actually produce most of the food that we eat. Some notable examples being bread, that is produced with microbes. Also, for those of you over 21, beer, you'll get to it eventually if you're under. And even, which is to me less expected, is chocolate. Even that is produced with the help of various microbes. So it's really kind of present in a lot of the foods that you just kind of take for granted. But they wouldn't be possible, or at least as easy, if we did not have the help of these kind of biological organisms. So the star player that I'm going to be covering today is this little guy I think of as a Pac-Man dude going through his world, known as yeast. So this type of microbe you most commonly hear of in bread, if you've ever made bread or any of those kinds of recipes, are like, add a packet of yeast, let it rise. So this is the little organism they're talking about. What is yeast? So I have a little clip for you here. Shown is some actual microscopy of a yeast. So they're very small little microbes, but if you look at them on a microscope, hopefully this will play. This is basically what yeast is. It's a very small organism, bigger than a bacteria, which you may have heard of, but it is single-celled, so each of these are individual cells that are free-floating and free-living, and they grow by just budding apart, as you can see here, and multiplying. The green actually is completely irrelevant, but it allows you to see a bunch of these cells multiplying and dividing and being happy little tiny Pac-Man dudes. So these are also known as, if my slides work, baker's yeast. So as I brought up to you just a second ago, most commonly you hear of these being used in making bread, but they're also called budding yeast for the reason you saw in the video, that they reproduce by just budding off each other and just continually cloning themselves in that way. So why are they useful to us? Why do we even use yeast for most of our food? Well, how they live is they go about wanting to eat food, much like we do. In their case, sugar and various other nutrients that they will encounter as they roam around their environment. And while in the process of eating this, what they then secrete out are such things as carbon dioxide, air, as you were introduced to in the earlier section, and also alcohol. So this process is known as fermentation. And basically it's how when they eat sugars, they then produce these two byproducts, as well as a variety of other chemicals which are numerous and depend on the different yeast you're looking at. But the primary process that we're concerned with in the cooking part of this whole thing is the production of carbon dioxide and alcohol. So if you think back to how you produce air by using either baking soda or whipping it into it with egg whites, the yeast actually also can produce air for you. So if you want to introduce air into your bread, you could do it chemically, or you could just add some yeast that will eat the sugars and thus produce carbon dioxide. Which brings me to my first example, baking bread. So if you look at any bread recipe, it usually starts with adding three main ingredients: flour, which is a carbohydrate, starch, it also has a lot of sugars in it, as well as water and yeast itself. So when you mix these ingredients, what you're basically doing at the biological level is you're giving the yeast a food source. You're taking this microbe, you're giving it water and sugars, which it can metabolize and eat, And as they sit there, the yeast will continue to grow and bud, as you saw in that video, eating up your sugars and producing carbon dioxide by fermentation. And so when they say let rise in a warm location in a given recipe, that's because yeast actually like a balmy 30 degrees Celsius, which is 86 degrees Fahrenheit, a nice warm hot day, which for us isn't so pleasant, but for them it's just the greatest. And so then they will grow fast, and you end up with your dough rising because the air that they're producing is getting trapped within that structure, and it's expanding. So you do this with the dough expanding from the CO2, the carbon dioxide that's being produced, and then ultimately you take this dough and you can bake it. So as you were introduced to earlier with Renee, this is the Maillard reaction that browns it, and you end up with a nice brown crusty loaf of bread. So here the primary purpose of the yeast is the introduction of air. So if you look at a cross-section of bread, this would be a nice crusty loaf. These pockets, which you can find, which makes it all fluffy and you have these holes, those are the pockets of air that were trapped as a result of the yeast producing CO2 within the dough structure. And as you can see, there again, the primary concern is you want your dough to be not just like flat, completely devoid of structure. You want it to actually be big and fluffy and have these nice pockets of air and be a nice loaf of bread. But that isn't actually the only thing that the yeast will produce for you. Which brings me to my next example, again limited to the older members of the audience, but the brewing of beer. So if you've ever had beer, you'll get there. You've noticed there are actually quite a few varieties, and they taste different and they have different characters. And if we just have something as simple as yeast producing alcohol and carbon dioxide, you might imagine, where does all this variety come from? It's a very simple process. It would seem you would always get just the same beer. You just have alcohol produced by the yeast. But this is not actually true. So as I mentioned, the primary core process of fermentation that we were considering earlier is simply the production of carbon dioxide and alcohol through this process. But there are the byproducts, which I kind of skimmed over earlier and are varied in nature. But these are actually flavor chemicals. And so here you can have yeast producing various different chemicals that are distinctive of different foods, such as bananas, apples, or pineapple. And there are a whole host of other flavor chemicals that different types of yeast, which are shown here in different colors, could potentially produce depending on their own biology. And we as people have noticed this. We're just like, oh, this one tastes a little different. Why does this one taste like bananas? And so based on our knowledge of that, we're able to use different types of yeast to produce the different flavors that we want in the foods that we're making. And so we can introduce those chemicals without actually having bananas in your beer. It's just a yeast that happens to produce the chemical of bananas that is fermenting your beer. And so you can use different types of yeast to produce different beers and by simply selecting the kind of yeast that you're using, you end up with a different product. So these can vary in different ways. One of them is in what temperature they prefer to grow at. As I mentioned earlier, most yeast grow optimally at around 30 degrees. But there's actually variation in this. Some of them prefer a little warmer, a little colder. And having observed this over time, people were able to select that to produce different products. So for instance, there are certain yeasts that grow well at cold temperatures, so more like 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius. And so these are used in producing lager beers. So these are cold fermented beers, and you specifically have to use this class of lager yeasts to produce them. So most home brewers wouldn't be producing this because you'd have to keep it cold. But you can also have ones that grow optimally at room temperature, so around 77 degrees. And so these are now called ale yeasts. And so this is primarily how ale beers are produced. And the distinction is really the temperature at which the yeast are metabolizing at. Where do they grow optimally? But there are other, kind of parameters here. There is also the type of grain that you use. So with beer, kind of similarly to the case that I mentioned with bread, you have to give the yeast a food source. In this case, you're giving them a kind of processed type of grain, which is, again, starches, carbohydrates, sugars, all those kinds of things that yeast eventually can eat. You can choose different types of grains that go into your beer. For instance, there are such things as wheat, barley, and oats, or different kinds of grains. And when they're broken down through usually mechanical and some chemical processes in the brewing process, you end up with different flavors being produced because of the different mixtures of sugars present in those different kinds of grains that you started out with. And actually, different yeasts have different preferences in terms of these sugars and which they will eat first, which they will eat later, how fast they eat them. And this can also affect the flavor that's produced in the beer that you're brewing from that grain beyond simply the different flavor of the grains themselves. And a little asterisk here, research in my lab is related to this. So if you go on the lab tour later, I can talk to you more about sugar preferences of yeast and how they're really kind of, in a way, making thoughtful choices, you might say, about what sugars they're eating. But again, this is only limited to those of us above 21, unfortunately. However, you can enjoy yeast in your beverages in a trendy drink known as kombucha, which you may or may not have heard of, shown here in an array of colors and types. And what this basically is a kind of tea that is fermented by microbes. So up until now, I've been primarily focusing on things that are produced by yeast only. But kombucha is a bit of a special case in many ways. Kombucha is made as a group effort of multiple microbes, so it's not just yeast this time. Here you can see a rather rubbery looking sponge type thing. This is actually a whole mat made out of microbes. It's known within that kombucha brewing community as a synthetic community of bacteria and yeast, also known as SCOBY. So this is your handy SCOBY friend. It is made up of yeast, as we saw earlier, but also bacteria. And this network of the two different types of organisms makes this structure that you then use to produce your fermented tea. So, since you probably have not heard of this earlier, what exactly do you do to make kombucha? Shown here is a bit of a cross-section. You have the nutrient source, the tea, waters, and sugars that your microbes are going to end up eating. You have your SCOBY, so that rubbery kind of mat floats on top and kind of seals over the top of the tea. It sits there, eats the tea and sugars and things that are below it, and metabolize, produce chemicals that then, continue to concentrate within there. And lastly, because you really don't want other things falling into this nice little community that you have of the microbes you actually do want, we tend to put a breathable seal over. So they need access to oxygen in order to grow, but you also don't want random things falling in. And actually, in a way, even without this additional step that we do, because we want to be like super sure we don't get some nasty random piece of mold falling in, the SCOBY itself, the structure is kind of, because it's a symbiotic relationship, it's good for both of them that they form it because it blocks physically things from falling in. So if they want to just have this food source all to themselves and not really involve other microbes, it's actually beneficial to them that they form this network that prevents other things from actually colonizing their food source. But we take advantage of it to make a tea that may or may not be to everyone's tastes, but is a nice non-alcoholic fermented beverage to be enjoyed by all. So what is happening inside this fermented tea? I just mentioned that it's non-alcoholic, but yeast produce alcohol, right? So within the SCOBY, you have your yeast, as before, producing a carbon dioxide and alcohol again, but instead now you also have bacteria present. So typically, for making kombucha tea, we select bacteria that eat the alcohol. And what they produce are various acids, for example, vinegar and other simple acids, and as well as other flavor as a result of their metabolic processes. So if you can try the kombucha here, and if you've tried other cases of it, you may have noticed it's a relatively sweet beverage. And this is partly because the sugar that is added to the kombucha is not only for the yeast to eat, but also because in the process of fermentation, there's so many acids produced that it really would taste like vinegar if you didn't add a whole bunch of sugar to make it taste better. Which begs the question of why anyone decided to do this in the first place, but that is not known historically. They're like, well, this tea exists and it sounds probiotic, so we're going to market it. But it tastes good, it's fermented, it has carbon dioxide, and it's non-alcoholic. So we've covered a variety of different foods, and so to sum all this together, not only the biology of it, but also the chemistry of it, there is the quintessential biological and chemical symbiotic good, which is the pretzel. And so how is this made? I'm going to walk you through the process. Once again, you start off with mixing your various ingredients, your flour, your water, your yeast, and you let it rise. So this is using yeast, not chemistry, but yeast to produce your air. Then when you shape it into that traditional pretzel knot, you then proceed to boil it in a baking soda solution. So here's the chemistry again coming in. The funny trick here is that the Maillard reaction, which you know is responsible for browning and happens at high temperatures, is actually accelerated in a basic environment. So the baking soda is a base, And so by boiling the pretzel and coating it in the solution of baking soda, you're actually making it easier for the Maillard reaction to happen later when you bake the pretzel. And so you then proceed to bake it at a high temperature, sufficiently high you end up getting Maillard browning, and you end up with this really brown, crusty pretzel. So if you hadn't boiled it in that baking soda solution, it would pretty much look kind of pale and white. It wouldn't end up having that same nice, deep, crusty brown. And also, I say here baking soda, as Renee mentioned earlier, traditionally this is done with a much harsher base, so the equivalent of Drano, which isn't commercially food grade. Lye, as it's called, is not commercially available as much here. So if you've ever had a pretzel overseas, it probably is a lot browner than something you would typically find in the States. But you can achieve a similar effect at home simply by using baking soda and not necessarily needing to dunk your pretzel in Drano, which you could try, would not recommend, but you would get a very brown pretzel in the end. So I wouldn't say don't eat it, but do try it and see what happens. Science. And so with that, first want to just thank all the contributors that we have had for this talk, and I also am opening up for questions based on everything I've just said. Yep.
When you were showing the different kinds of beers, there was like the cold one and room temperature one.
Right.
But the bottles are different because one is like a darker bottle. So does the light affect the process? Or because sometimes the light change the flavor of the beer, for example?
Okay, so the question was, when I was showing the beers earlier, the different beers were in different colored bottles, and whether light affects the process of what flavors you end up with in your beer. So in the bottle itself, after bottling, the yeast is still alive and fermenting, but the light exposure isn't as much important to them because yeast aren't hugely photosensitive. So they aren't as regulated by light. And so it may affect some of the chemistry, potentially, of what is happening within the bottle, but the yeast themselves probably won't metabolize any differently based on whether they're in a light condition or not. Part of it is just for the aesthetics of the bottle. It's like, it's pretty looking if it's in a brown one, or you could use a clear bottle. But that's less of an influence on the flavor than things like temperature or what nutrients you give the yeast. Yep.
In the bread dough, it seems that no bacteria is added, so the chemical reaction does produce alcohol. Why don't we feel it when we eat it? It's because of the exposure to.
Right, so it's a great question. So the question was, in the bread you don't add bacteria, so there should still be the alcohol present from when the yeast were metabolizing. So why isn't bread alcoholic? So there are a couple reasons there. First of all, the bread is only usually left with, in the presence of yeast, you only rise it for, say, a couple hours. And so in that amount of time, it's enough to produce carbon dioxide, but there's still relatively low amounts of ethanol produced. With beer, you have to ferment it for days, weeks, and so it's present, the yeast are present there and metabolizing, producing alcohol for a much more extended period of time than they are present in the bread. So it doesn't build up as much. Furthermore, when you bake the bread, a lot of that ethanol, which is like water, will just evaporate. It actually evaporates faster than water, and so a lot of that just disperses when you put it in the oven and leaves the bread. But an interesting point that you mentioned about not adding bacteria to bread, in some cases you actually do. So if you've ever had sourdough, that is produced by adding bacteria that produce lactic acid. So that's where the sourness comes from in a sourdough, which you can approximate if you just leave a regular yeast dough for longer so that you build up more ethanol. That makes it kind of taste more sour, but it's not exactly the same thing as true sourdough, which is like a mix of different bacteria and yeast. Yep.
How does beer differ from wine?
Okay, so the question is, how does beer differ from wine? Primarily, a lot of the process of making beer and making wine is similar. It is the fermentation by yeast, but what you give them to ferment is different. So in the case of wine, it's typically done with grapes, which have much higher sugar content than, say, milled oats, barley, or wheat. And some of the way in which it is treated prior to the fermentation is different. So in beer making, there are a lot of more steps that go into it beforehand. With wine, it's simply a lot of it just crushing the grapes and then leaving it with the yeast to ferment. But it is the same basic processing happening with microbes and yeast, but a lot of what you give them and how you end up treating it other than just the yeast you put in is different between the two. Yep, in the back.
beer. So there's like the beer that's got the alcohol and there's the beer with the no alcohol. How do you remove the alcohol from the beer?
All right, so the question is, you have both alcoholic and non-alcoholic versions of beer. How do they get rid of the alcohol in the non-alcoholic version? That is an excellent question.
Like activated chocolate filter.
I think there's a possibility that you filter it. I'm not entirely sure of how you remove it. It definitely does taste different. That I can guarantee from having tried it with not much pleasure involved. But yeah, they chemically remove the ethanol after they have this brewing process. But it doesn't leave the same flavors as you would have with having the ethanol present. So it always is slightly different. It isn't like exactly beer minus the alcohol. There's some chemical process that goes on there. But yeah, no, good question.
The alcohol's cooked off.
Cooked off. That is a chemical process. But that may also be, it might concentrate in that form. But yeah, no, the ethanol is cooked off, as the internet so wisely tells us. Yep.
What makes a beer more hoppy than something?
So the question is, what makes a beer more hoppy than another one? So hops are actually this kind of like flower, a tiny little bud. It is a flower that they put in, which has a certain flavor. And so literally, most beers are more hoppy because they added more hops. So hops are an ingredient that they add to the mixture in addition to the grain and other, chemicals that they might add into the beer prior to adding the yeast. And hoppier beers, typically they just add more hops. Yep.
You know the slide with the jar with the SCOBY and the tea and the sugar and water in it? If the SCOBY was at the bottom and the tea and sugar and water were at the top, could the SCOBY still eat the tea, sugar, and water?
All right, great question. So in the slide I showed you showing how you make kombucha with the SCOBY floating at the top of the jar, would the SCOBY still be able to do its job if it were actually not at the top but sunk down at the bottom? It requires oxygen, so I don't think it would survive quite as well due to the organisms that they chose, because they need exposure to air, so they wouldn't grow as well down there at the bottom. They would have to have that air-water interface in order to survive. Furthermore, just by the structure of it, it's actually a very floaty, light structure, so it would just naturally rise. You'd have to really like push it down there to keep it at the bottom. But no, you do require the oxygen, which is why it's a breathable seal that they put over the top. You didn't just like screw on a cap onto the jar and leave it, because otherwise it would deplete the oxygen in the air and then they would stop growing, because they need oxygen, kind of like us. They need to breathe. But yeah. Yes?
So what makes the different alcohol content between different beers?
Right, so the question is, what makes beers have different alcohol content? So part of that is how long you leave it to ferment. So the longer you ferment a beer, often the more alcohol that builds up. Possibly it's also concentration. After you've prepared your beer, you can then concentrate it down further by, for example, instance boiling or other methods to remove water from it. And so the amount of alcohol to water, the ratio changes and it becomes higher. And also depending on what sugars or nutrients you start off with, how long the yeast are able to produce alcohol and metabolize.
You get all these different yeast strains.
Right. There are also, as I mentioned, there are different yeast strains that have different outputs of alcohol. So the basic process of fermentation being the same, they can differ in the way in how much they use fermentation in order to live and survive, because if you've ever heard of, there's fermentation and respiration as two alternative modes of producing energy. And while technically they could use both at the same time, some prefer to use one over the other. And so based on what yeast you then choose to use to ferment your beer, you can have one that's like super fermenting and producing a ton of alcohol, or one that's a little bit like not so hot in the fermentation, and it could be lighter. All right, yep, first up, or in the blue.
I used to visit a friend of mine who was Armenian and his family, and his mom grew yogurt in the fridge. And I'm wondering, and once she started the process, it would continue on from that document. And I'm just wondering why wouldn't it dilute itself eventually? Because it seemed like she only had to add the yeast once. I mean, if the yeast is forever, replicating and cloning itself, then why doesn't the dairy part of it dilute?
Right. So the question is, for example, when making yogurt, you add the yeast and then you just leave it, and it continues growing. And why doesn't the yogurt get more diluted as the yeast continue to metabolize? I believe in yogurt it's not so much yeast actually, it's a bacterium lactobacillus. But as far as the dilution, the sheer amount, the amount you inoculate with, at some point their growth they just grow so much that they will start inhibiting each other because they're like, oh, there's not enough nutrients, and then they just stop growing and wait until there's more. So there is already built into the system, they have the sense to be able to tell when they're getting too crowded, and they will just stop growing and kind of hang out, eventually die, but then they're just like going to be in stasis for a little bit, waiting for more nutrients to come. So there's kind of like an upper limit in how much of that microbe you can end up getting. Also because in this case with this, like I mentioned, lactobacillus is used to produce that sour taste in sourdough. There is acid building up within their environment as they continue growing and eating, and they can only tolerate so much, which you would think is a bit strange because you're producing acid, shouldn't you be used to it? But they can only actually really tolerate certain levels, and above certain levels of acid in their environment, they're like, okay, this is too much for me, I'm going to stop and shut down for a bit. And so it will only really peak at a certain point.
So maybe the pH is, maybe that's a balancing effect for a lot of...
Yeah, so regarding pH and microbe growth, rather like us, there are certain harsh pHs that they just really can't survive at. And so they will themselves regulate such that their own growth, such that they don't kind of destroy their environment for themselves, which we humans try to do as well, to some degree. Little environmentalist plug. Yep, in the red.
Why do they eat sugar? Why don't they eat something else?
All right, so the question is why...
Something to produce like alcohol or the chemicals?
So the question is, why do yeast eat sugar and not something else? Because sugar is great. Well, no, because yeast like sugar because it has actually a lot of energy in it. It's the same way you eat sugar, you get a super amount of energy because it's a great energy source. It's the same for yeast. It's very simple, it's easy for them to digest, and so they prefer eating it simply because it's easier for them to get energy out of it than if they're eating something more complicated like a protein or bigger kind of molecules. So they can eat other things, but sugar is very basic and just really easily chewable for the little Pac-Man. So effectively, it's just most convenient.
So they still eat other things?
They can. Usually what they do is, so the question is whether yeast eat other things. They do. They take other compounds and they often will break them down until they hit sugars. So sugars are building blocks for a lot of other bigger complex molecules, and so they will just kind of basically hack apart those molecules until they can get down to sugars, which are one of the most simple things that they can, shunt into their metabolism. And so they will break it to the point of being a sugar, and they're like, okay, now I can digest this. So it's like the chewable bite for yeast. Oh, yep, question.
So I had a question regarding single-celled organisms. To what degree they're single-celled obviously, but where does that stop? And other than just the obvious part, I guess where's the distinction between that and the multi-celled organism? And also can strains of yeast or other cultures be trademarked in a sense, so you can't copy the makeup?
Okay, so there are two good questions. First of all is what is the line between, say, a single-celled and a multi-celled organism, which is actually a very complicated question. A lot of it is dependent on how well can that thing survive on its own if you isolate it from all its buddies, pretty much. And so multicellular, it kind of is a cooperative system that has a structure and kind of requires the presence of all these other things as a network to survive. Whereas with the yeast, you can take a single yeast, put it somewhere, and it can happily live on its own. It doesn't need other yeasts per se. That's not taking into account the fact that you can have sexual reproduction, so you may need multiple copies of an individual, but still they're able to survive as an individual. Maybe not reproduce, but survive. So it's actually a relatively complicated process, or question of single-celled versus multi-celled at a biological level, but that would be kind of like a short summary. And the second question was regarding, can you trademark a yeast? And in fact, companies do try to trademark things. So as you may have heard in other lectures or in other contexts, different types of yeast or strains of yeast have certain DNA, and so based on that sequence, they may or may not be called proprietary by a given company, like I use X kind of yeast and it has my trademark on it. which is a relatively hard thing to control and which often causes a lot of ethical issues, because how are you to prevent some other yeast from not getting that same DNA, becoming that same type of organism, and why can't I use it? So while there are efforts to trademark like combinations of yeast, or like I have this particular packet that I can mass produce and thus sell and trademark, it's a relatively hard thing to do to just say, though, I own this kind of organism. So it's usually more like mixtures, or I was able to breed this one, and so now it's mine. Yep.
Yeah, it's a question, especially like in case of wine, for example, you know, like it ages over time and supposedly it tastes better as it ages. Is that also related to the microbes that are in the wine, or is that something else?
Right, so the question is that wines are said to age and taste better over time. Is that due to the microbes that are present in the wine? Part of it could be continual effects of the microbes breaking things down. Part of it is just the chemistry of, as it sits there, slow chemical reactions happen such that different flavor compounds can continue to increase in concentration over an extended period of time. Finer details of that I'm actually not sure about, but it is a combination of both, I would think. Right, question in pink.
So you mentioned that the difference more or less between the ales and lagers was the temperature fermentation. What about with stouts? Is that a temperature or more of just like a starch difference?
I believe with stouts it is the starch. It is a type of ingredient you put into it that creates that kind of like chocolatey flavor is distinctive of stouts. Yeah, I think it's I believe oats that are in stouts, though I wouldn't be quoted on that, but I believe that's what it was. Oh, yep.
If you want to increase the longevity of yeast, say when you buy packets of these things, do they maybe add some carbohydrates, or do they add something to allow it to live, to survive?
Right, so great question, which is, when you buy a packet of yeast, how do they make it last longer? Do they add sugar so that they can survive better? Actually, when you buy it in the packet form, they're in a kind of a dormant state. So they've been dried down, and in the absence of water, they can enter this like spore-like state where they're just not really growing and living, but they're just kind of waiting in stasis until they reach an environment with water again and can start growing. And so that is why when you want to activate your yeast, you add it to water and maybe some sugars to get them kick-started. So up until then, actually the best way to keep your packet of yeast from expiring or eventually dying is to just keep it really dry. Because that way they will stay in that dormant state, that dormant spore form, which can last for a much longer period of time, and they won't, wake up and then be like, oh crap, I have no nutrients, croak. And so, actually in the biology side of it, the spore state that I mentioned is the way that yeast have adapted to survive harsh conditions or go through periods of time where they don't have access to nutrients. So we, wanting them to last longer, take advantage of that to trigger them to go into that dormant state and just stay there until we're ready to use them. Yep, last question.
Could you extract yeast from plants?
That is a great question. Can you extract yeast from plants? And that was a perfect setup. I couldn't have asked you for better. Yes, you can, and I have some actually upstairs that were extracted from apples. But yes, yeast grow on a lot of different surfaces and plants, primarily if they're able to have access again to some sort of sugar. So in the case of fruit, if it falls off a tree, hits the ground, bursts open a little bit, some of the juice comes out. The juice is sweet, it has sugars in it, yeast can grow on that, but they can grow on a lot of other surfaces just by simply kind of scavenging off these different sugars present in the environment. So yep, you can definitely isolate them from plants. All right, so thank you again for showing up. As just a little quick reminder, we have the survey at the bottom. For those of you who signed up for the lab tour, I shall see you shortly, and thanks again.